Alright, so I read 57 books over the last year, and some of them were full of actionable advice, some of them helped me understand the world better, and some of them were just really fun to read. And so in this video I'm going to go through 7 of those books that I think that pretty much anyone could benefit from reading, and I'm also going to try and explain the most important thing I took away from each one. And we're going to start with Blood, Sweat and Chrome, the wild and true story of Mad Max Fury Road by Kyle Buchanan. And so this one is an oral history of Fury Road, which means that the author spoke to more than 100 different people, from the cast and crew to like the stunt team, the producers, directors, everybody else who had anything to do with the film. And so just getting Fury Road made was an incredibly complex process. The director George Miller started writing the script more than a decade before filming actually started. And one of the most interesting things about that script is that he then worked with a comic artist called Brendan McCarthy and a storyboard specialist called Mark Sexton to turn it into more than 3,500 images, which they eventually used as basically the storyboard for the entire film. And if you watch the film, it adheres to that script pretty closely. Unfortunately, this isn't really a standard way of filming, so this caused some issues with actors, including Tom Hardy, who later apologized to George Miller for the way he behaved on set sometimes. But they also had all sorts of issues because they were filming in the Namibian desert, where the entire cast were living in this village in the middle of basically nowhere, worrying about robberies all the time. But what I really loved about this book was the level of detail that everyone brought to the film. So for instance, every character in the film, from the War Boys to the Vuvolini, has their own backstory, but so does every little prop and accessory on the vehicles the crew built for the film. And so this is one of those books that's so full of cool facts and anecdotes that you'll probably stop reading it a bunch of times just to read it out to whoever happens to be sitting closest to you. But it's also a really inspiring read about the sort of things that you can create if everybody involved in a project is really committed to making it as good as they possibly can. Like when you watch Fury Road, all the love that people put into it comes out on the screen, even if it's not immediately noticeable why. So you do get this sense of this huge world that goes way beyond anything that's being directly explained in the film, and I think that comes from the effort that's been put in by the prop department and the costumiers and everyone else on the film. And then another book that touches on similar topics is Arnold Schwarzenegger's Be Useful, 7 Rules for Life. And so this is kind of half biography and half self-help book, so it's full of lessons from Arnold's career as a bodybuilder, and then an actor, and then a politician. And some of it, like work your ass off, might seem kind of obvious, but it's coming from a guy who's achieved incredible things in life. And so when you hear that from the guy who practiced this gun flip so many times that his knuckles started bleeding just for like 2 seconds in the film, it really drives home the value of bringing your best to everything you do. And it's just an interesting perspective on how hard Arnold still works and how he's brought the skills that he built as a bodybuilder to being a successful, hard-working politician. And so I think the biggest takeaway from this book is what you can achieve with a combination of curiosity and hard work. And that's something that Arnold drives home over and over again with anecdotes in this book. And I think it's something that he's demonstrated throughout his life. But if you want to learn about the perils of the other approach, or what I would call the get-rich-quick mindset, then a book I would really recommend is Number Go Up by Zeke Foe. So this is what Ryan Holiday would call a cautionary biography. So it's a book about somebody's life going pretty badly wrong and all the mistakes they made in it, which hopefully can help you avoid making some of the same mistakes. So it's mostly about the rise and fall of Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX, from a financial journalist who was really on the ground during all that stuff. But it's also about various NFT and crypto scams that were kind of happening in the same boom period for all of that stuff. And it's a super readable overview of the whole area, and it's a super understandable explainer of things like the blockchain and stable coins and the most common crypto scams in really understandable language, including a bit that explains Tether via an episode of DuckTales. And if there's a takeaway to this one, I think it's that some people do really get rich quick. Like for instance, Yuga Labs, the people that made the Bored Ape NFTs, were at one point valued at the same price that Disney acquired Lucasfilm for. But the lesson seems to be that if you're not the company that's making the money off this stuff, you might well be the one that's going to lose all your money. This book also talks a lot about the environmental cost of Bitcoin, which ties in nicely to my next recommendation, which is Fireweather by John Vaillant. So Valent is the author who wrote The Tiger and the Golden Spruce, which are both amazing books that I would recommend to anyone. And he always has an environmental element to his storytelling, but in this one it comes a bit more to the fore because he's talking about the way that climate change is increasing the risks posed by wildfires, using the 2016 Fort McMurray wildfire in Alberta, Canada, as like the core of the narrative. And what Valent's really amazing at is explaining things from first principles. So in this book he explains everything from the mechanics of fire and forest fires in particular, to the science of firefighting, the formation of fossil fuels, and how climate change and climate change denialism have both evolved alongside each other. So it is a fantastic book, if a little bit depressing. If you're looking for something that's a little bit less troubling, I strongly recommend The Tiger, which is just like a fantastic adventure story. By the way, this is about the best 7 books I read this year, but if you'd like insights from the other 50, then I've got a bunch of those in my newsletter. There's a free link in the comments. And next we have our first fiction book on the list, which is Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. So this one tells the story of 2 childhood friends who reconnect in college and then form this creative partnership where they go on to make a series of successful video games. And it's kind of an examination of how relationships evolve over time and how the pursuit of art can bring people together but also put a strain on their friendships. And I really don't want to spoil it any more than that because I do think it's fantastic and it really is worth reading. And it's really well written and it's got some really interesting ideas about the creative process. But I think the one line that really stuck with me from it is one character's grandmother who survived the Holocaust saying, "Life is very long unless it is not." And I think when you first hear it, that seems like kind of an obvious thing to say. But the more I thought about it, the more kind of insightful it felt because for most people, yeah, life is pretty long. And actually, when you're in your 20s or even 30s or 40s, it can feel like the mistakes you've made or the things you've done or haven't might like haunt you forever. But that's probably not true because for a lot of people, life is pretty long and a lot of problems are fixable. But equally, maybe your life or the life of someone you care about isn't going to last that long. And so you have to find ways of making each individual day count and being kind to the people you most care about. And I think one of the biggest challenges that most of us encounter is finding ways to find a balance between planning for the long term and not worrying about things too much, but also making the most of each individual day or week or month. And so I thought this book was a really good reminder of that and just also a great read. Next up we've got See What You're Missing by Will Gompertz, who's a former museum director and an art critic and actually wrote one of my favourite books of all time on art. And so this one kind of explores how we can enrich our everyday experiences by just changing a few things about the way we look at the world. Whether that means looking at nature like David Hockney or seeing perspective like Cézanne. And it's 31 different essays about artists, some of whom you'll definitely have heard of and some of whom you probably won't, and the different ways they look at the world. And so this one's really packed with like facts and anecdotes, and you'll definitely learn something about art reading it. But it's also kind of a reminder that we can always improve our everyday experience by just changing the way we look at things. So I've been leaving my phone at home or in my bag a lot this year, and I think by looking at clouds like John Constable or light like James Turrell, you can really get away from social media and open your eyes to the world that's around you. And it'll also teach you a ton about art, so it's a really strong recommend. And then the final book that I'm going to recommend that you read over the next 12 months is The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. So in case you haven't heard of him, Collins was actually quite a good friend of Charles Dickens, and he sort of references him in the book. And this was basically the first modern style detective novel. It's this sort of classic locked room mystery that was a clear influence on the later Sherlock Holmes books, and it's so readable that I got through all 450 pages of it in about a week and a half. If you tried getting into Victorian literature before and failed, then I would say it's a great entry point because the way the mystery gets unravelled through like multiple characters' perspectives throughout the book keeps you reading, and it's quite action-packed, and it's also very funny. After I got through this, I also read Jane Austen's Emma, which is excellent if a little bit harder going because it's all about kind of social mores and not so much heavy on the action. So The Moonstone really helped me get into a genre of literature that was kind of hard to wrap my head around at first. So that's the books I loved the most this year. If you've got any recommendations, I would love to hear about them in the comments. And if you'd like more book recommendations, you can find what I was reading last year over here. Thanks for watching.